consulting firm based in Melbourne. She specialises in ESG measurement, strategy, communication and education, and her experience spans community and stakeholder engagement, corporate social responsibility, carbon accounting and climate strategy. So you can see why we were really keen to have her join us for today. She believes that business can and should be a force for good and is committed to uncovering new ways to embed sustainability both within long-term organisational strategy and day-to-day business operations. She holds a Master of Environment and Sustainability from Monash University, specialising in leadership for sustainable development. And she'll be taking us on what it looks like to go through your first sustainability plan. So we're going to hand over to Abbie now to take us through her presentation. Thanks, Abbie.
Thanks, Kate, and hi, everyone. Yeah, really fantastic discussions by Carl and Amanda, so I've got some hard acts to follow. I'm just going to share my screen. Hopefully everyone can see that there now. Okay, I would first like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land that I'm tuning in from today, which is the Boon Wurrung people of the Wurundjeri country, and acknowledge that sovereignty was never ceded, and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. So the agenda today for this session is really providing a rapid fire run through of how to build your first sustainability plan, and to kind of talk through that on a step-by-step basis and try and make it as clear and as simple and straightforward as possible if you are just starting out in this area. So hopefully it's a useful session for you. To begin with, we do have a little icebreaker in Slido. I would love to get a bit more detail on who is in the room. So there's 4 questions that we have for you to answer. I am just going to post the link in the chat, but if you head to slido.com, enter in that code, or even just scan the QR code there. And while you're doing that, I will activate the poll. I'm actually just going to share the results here with you as we go as well. So we've got first question, what industry are you in? We've got finance, tech, superannuation, fascinating. Okay, interesting. Lots of tech, which is kind of what we suspected, perhaps anticipated for this session, which is great, but it's amazing to see a real variety there. Very good. Interesting. Consulting, media, okay, great. Interesting. So we've got healthcare. Fascinating. Thanks, everyone. Some in climate tech as well, so that's really good. Also, we are interested to know how many employees are in your business. So trying to think about what resources you might have internally to be able to tackle some of this work, and kind of what that might look like in terms of putting it all into practice. So we've got quite a few small businesses, large businesses over 100 people, 24%. Interesting. And then some kind of SMEs in there as well. Great, thank you. Next question, where are you currently at on your sustainability journey? Are you just starting out? Have you kind of put some things in place and you're trying to make improvements? Or are you yet to begin? And there's no right or wrong answer to any of this. Quite a few just starting out. Some may already have some practices in place, which is great, and some kicking goals. That is amazing. That's what we want to see. Fantastic, well done. And lastly, we're really eager to hear why you are here today. You know, what's your motives? You're here to learn, here to get some inspiration, do a bit of a sense check, anything that comes to mind. Learn, inspiration, yeah. Great. Inspiration, practical tips, good. We're going to be as practical as possible today. Inspired, learn, network, hear from others. Amazing. Inspired. Beautiful. Thanks, everyone. Really appreciate that. Sorry, that was a pretty quick run through, but really good just to do a bit of a sense check and get that kind of grounding before we launch into this session. So by way of introduction, I thought I was looking for a quote to kind of kick us off for this session. And I thought that this one really was perfectly kind of framing, I think, where we're all at. You know, we all want our businesses to do well, but inevitably when the planet is not doing well, it does impact the way that we do business, whether that's indirectly or directly. I was on a panel discussion with a sustainability leader from Microsoft about a year ago, and he said this quote, and it really just resonated with me, because ultimately there is no business on a dead planet, which is, you know, very morbid to think about, but I think just clearly shows how relevant it is for all of us. I also wanted to kick off with some common startup tensions, because there are some tensions that are really specific to startups. And so it's obviously worth acknowledging what they are and being aware of what they are, because no doubt for the startups that are on the call, you will encounter some of these challenges. So I think sometimes developing policies and having things very structured and formalized is obviously a great thing to try and do and try and achieve to ensure that you are embedding the right practices and processes early on in your business. But ultimately what we find when we work with startups is that, you know, startups are so agile, things are changing and shifting so much. So it can be really challenging to effectively, I think, introduce policies that really solve all the challenges. And I think a fine balance of being flexible, being agile is really important, as well as kind of that policy development, because ultimately you want to make sure that everything that you're working on is really useful. And if you are developing a policy to support your sustainability strategy, you just want to make sure that that is not sitting somewhere on a drive in a folder that no one looks at. You want it to be a really useful anchor point for people to refer back to over time. We also need to be aware that, as well-intentioned as you may be with this work, that inevitably there will be 10, 20, 30, you know, really time-sensitive things that end up kind of grabbing your attention. And so the sustainability work, while it is extremely important, it is extremely time sensitive and critical. Inevitably, there is always tensions with your to-do list, and you may end up prioritizing other things over this work. So that's just a really important thing to be aware of early on, to try and put some preventative measures in place to make sure that this work doesn't creep down the to-do list, and that you still are prioritizing it over time as much as you can. Another common perception, I think, with startups or with tech businesses is that you know, you might not have a big footprint to begin with, and that may be true in comparison to other businesses in other sectors, so relative to others, but you know, keeping it that way is often the challenge over time. And as Carl was chatting about some of those scope 3 indirect impacts, that is a really important area to be focusing in on. So it's not just all of your direct impacts. You need to be looking both, you know, upstream in your supply chain and downstream as well, and looking at all of those things that you might not easily be able to see right in front of you. And it's also hard for startups and growing businesses to set targets when inevitably you are bringing on more employees, you are having more revenue, creating more revenue each year. So you are inevitably going to be having a larger kind of impact over time. So then setting reduction targets can be challenging when you do have that growth, but there are frameworks out there that you can use to set targets that are considerate of the way that businesses are growing. So they're important considerations. I also just wanted to kick off with some assumptions because, you know, this session is very quick. There's a lot to get through. It'll probably be a bit of a brain overload, but really it is assuming that you already have buy-in from your stakeholders. You don't need to convince anyone that this work needs doing, although in reality that's not always the case. Sometimes you may need to do some heavy engagement to bring people on that journey with you. We're also assuming that you want to do something. You've all tuned in today, so that's obviously the case. And the session has been grounded in an assumption that you're not already doing something, but that's not to say that the content won't be valuable and interesting if you are already on your journey. So hopefully there'll be some new ideas and just another opportunity to do a bit of a sense check on your current approach. So we kind of summarized the process in these 6 steps. Whoops, I'll go back. So Kyle has already spoken a bit about the baselining, which you can see in the middle here. So what we're going to chat about today is really the engagement and measurement section, then setting your strategy, and then communicating with stakeholders. And we've kind of categorized it in those 3 different phases. But, you know, other people may choose to approach it in a slightly different way. And that's completely fine too. This is quite high level, but trying to be as practical as possible at the same time. But of course, if you were a larger business, if you were further ahead on your journey, you may try to go into more detail at each kind of step along the way. Okie dokie. So I'm now going to put a link to Google Doc in the chat because we have created a template for you to start working with. It is not in editing mode at the moment, so you will need to either make a copy of it or download it onto your desktop so that you have the ability to edit it and that everyone's not kind of editing the same document. So please let me know if you have any issues with accessing that, but hopefully that is all okay. I'm now going to talk through each of the 6 steps in the plan. And, you know, there is some guidance in there where I've put down some kind of brief notes and examples and kind of tips of how to best approach it along the way. So I will, yeah, thanks, Kate. So I'll just talk through each one step by step, but if you do have questions along the way, you're more than welcome to put them into the chat or even into Slido, and we'll try and get to them at the end. And you're also more than welcome to actually just start filling in the template as we go. I will leave that up to you. So finding your why, it is really, I think a lot of people, their eyes kind of glaze over when we talk about vision and you know, what's your why, kind of chatting about Simon Sinek's, you know, kind of philosophy around that. But it is actually really important to do that scoping work and that really reflective work when we're starting out on this sustainability strategy planning. And the reason for that is that it can really help you with your decision making over time. You know, understanding what the vision is, what success could look like, is really important to get buy-in from stakeholders as well. If you need to convince anyone, if you need to try and articulate your story and your vision for why you're doing this work, then understanding your why and being able to communicate that clearly to your stakeholders, including your employees and suppliers, it's a really essential part. So we would recommend here potentially discussing with your team and chatting about what their motivations and drivers are behind doing this work. And it might be that you just see it as being the right thing to do. You see it as being, you know, a must-have now rather than a nice-to-have, which it may have been in the past. There's no right or wrong answer here. It's just, I think, really helpful to do that reflection and make sure that you're clear on why you're doing this work to begin with. So then the next step from there is really knowing who your stakeholders are and being really clear and specific on how they influence your business and what those varying perspectives are as well. So we'll get into that in a moment. But really, I suppose the key challenge here is knowing how to engage with different stakeholders, knowing how to get their perspectives on the plan, knowing how also you can create value for your different stakeholders, rather than just creating the financial value for your shareholders. So it's really looking at, okay, what are the different considerations that we need to think about here? It may require some research, or it may be very clear to you who those stakeholders are. So if you know who they are, feel free to just kind of list them there. Oops, And yeah, list them there, and then that will be an important reference point for you to come back to over time when you need to start engaging with them. So from there, you would be trying to engage with those stakeholders to identify and analyze what we call your material sustainability issues. So basically this involves speaking with your stakeholders, trying to either conduct interviews with them or surveys with them and get their perspectives on what is most important to them relative to their relationship with your business. Because ultimately, there are a wide range of issues out there that you could choose to focus on. And early on in the beginning, it's unrealistic to be able to effectively address and manage all of those different issues if you're not being specific and prioritizing which ones to focus on in the short term versus the medium term versus the long term. So what we would typically do here is we would actually do quite a detailed stakeholder engagement exercise where we would potentially interview shareholders, run a survey with staff and community groups and any other relevant stakeholders, and we'd say, okay, which issues are really important to you? And then we need to also think about which issues impact on the success of the business the most, and which issues does the business impact on. So there's a range of different factors to consider. And it's all kind of comes together in what we call a materiality matrix, which I've got an example here. So this also covers off the social issues here as well. This is just an example case study, but typically today we're kind of honing in and looking at the environmental issues in particular. So this, where we've engaged with those stakeholders and got all of that feedback, we would then score those issues and average out the results, and you would get the importance of the issue to stakeholders on one axis, and then you'd get the impact of the issue on the business on another axis, and then basically the top right quadrant then becomes your priority issues that you would choose to focus on first in your sustainability plan. But in advance of, I suppose, doing any of that, you can start to kind of put the hat on of each individual stakeholder and maybe start to list into that template what you think the most important issues would be based on your unique understanding of your business and the operations and the different impacts and perspectives that your business has and that your stakeholders have as well. Great. From there, we are really diving into building the action plan. So the material issues that you've just identified in the past step, they become your focus area here on the left-hand side. So you don't need to be very prescriptive and exact about the issue, so that you can rename it, you can potentially categorize, group a few issues together, to create a broader focus area. So it doesn't have to be word for word the same issue, but you do need to make sure that each of your focus areas is covering off those important issues. From there, each issue you would identify some sustainability goals and targets. And as I'm sure you've kind of done with goal setting in the past, using the SMART format is a really important and valuable approach here. So that's ensuring that all of your goals are really specific, measurable, achievable, relevant, and time-bound. So initially you would probably limit those goals and targets from 1 to 3 for each focus area. So, you know, we don't want you to kind of put 10 or 20 targets and goals in place. That's, again, when you're just starting out, that's not a realistic kind of goal to set. So being as specific as you can will really help you in the long run here. And then from there, it's important to ensure that you are aligning those with your corporate strategy as well. So looking at, okay, what's our business goals over the next 5 to 10 years? How does this work align with, you know, our wider business? And then sometimes you may also set targets that are relative per dollar of revenue or per employee headcount. So those are what we call intensity targets, and they're really helpful when you're a growing business, as I spoke about earlier, which can be a challenge. So that would be a keen recommendation. From there, you would have specific actions and initiatives that relate to each of those goals and targets, and you would try and, again, be as specific as you can with those. And from there, you would need to figure out, okay, how can we monitor, how can we create a key performance indicator that helps to understand whether we've actually been effective, whether we've been successful in achieving those initiatives and those goals that we set. And to do that, you'll need to allocate a person a specific role to be responsible and really take ownership for each of those actions and initiatives that you have in place. And you'll also need to set some timeframes there as well, which will be timeframes for you to either achieve the goal or target, or for you to review that specific action or initiative. So typically, we would say to align those with your OKR cycles, or with a certain quarter. You know, it could be Q4 2022, for example, if you were aiming for the end of the year. So we've got some examples in the template, but yeah, I would recommend probably starting with maybe 1, 2, 3 max kind of focus areas, and then for each of those focus areas, thinking about what are 1 or 2 goals that we could look at and really work towards in a systematic way over time. So that would be my recommendation for building the plan. Obviously, it's worth noting here as well, we're not covering in this session measurement and kind of baselining. I think Carl's already spoken a bit about measurement, and there are some really good tools out there like Path Zero that can help you with that phase. But obviously, it's important for me to acknowledge that it is difficult for you to set targets and goals without knowing where you currently are at. So I would certainly recommend doing that reflective work, whether it's working with a consultant to do an audit, just really making sure that you know where you are and you know where you need to go, and then that will help you to set those goals. Okay. From there, we get into communication, and I always say there is absolutely no point me helping a business to put together a really clear, great, ambitious, comprehensive sustainability plan. If there's a breakdown with communication, that plan is not going to be effective. It's not going to be successful. It's not going to achieve the goals that it set out to. So it's really important to be crystal clear, both internally and externally, who is responsible for what, by when, what the expectations are, and what that vision is. So bringing all of your important stakeholders on that journey with you, getting their buy-in, getting them really excited about the role that they can play in achieving the vision and the plan is a really important piece of work. So externally, you know, some of your stakeholders, your customers perhaps, they might even have a role to play as well. So ensuring that you're able to communicate what that role is, how they can contribute positively to this work is a really, really effective way of implementing the plan. So again, being as specific as you can is really important. So trying to avoid jargon and fluff. You know, often people just won't understand what you're talking about, or if you're being too high level, people might become skeptical. There's more risks of greenwashing. So it's really important to ensure that you're fact checking everything that you're communicating along the way. Like Amanda spoke about earlier with misinformation, you need to make sure that you're being really careful that you're not miscommunicating or misleading anything in the way that you talk about your sustainability actions publicly. But ultimately, transparency is really key here. So acknowledging challenges that you have along the way is really important, and yeah, bringing customers on that journey with you to try and inspire and educate them along the way as you educate yourselves is always kind of best practice approach here. So there's a few prompting questions in the template in this section, which asks, you know, how you plan on communicating with different stakeholders, with different audiences. You might need different methods for each, and then trying to think about what your key messages would be, what you need to ask from your audience whether there's any call to action. Potentially, you know, with suppliers, you might need them to adhere to certain standard or a certain policy or kind of procedure that you end up putting in place. So yeah, don't think too much about the communication until you've gone through the plan. That is really kind of your second last step. And then the final kind of component is reporting on your progress. So this is a really important part of the plan. It's really helpful to keep you accountable and to do that reflective work and to assist with that transparency. And early on, if you are a small business, this can be quite simple and straightforward. It doesn't need to be a really long, convoluted, detailed plan like some of the large corporates would do. It can be as simple as, you know, 1 to 2 pages summarizing your key targets, how you're tracking against them, and communicating any reasons why your progress may not have been as good as you would have liked it to have been, and to be really clear about you know, where you're at and where you're going and how you're going to, I suppose, change your approach in future to try and improve things. So this is usually done on an annual basis. It's always good to contrast your performance against some kind of baseline benchmark. So when we do setting targets for carbon reduction, we would set a baseline year, and then you would, you know, set a target, whether it's 50, 80% reduction by that baseline, relative to that baseline year by X date. So you would be quite prescriptive about what that was. And then when you were reporting against that, you would be, yeah, have a very clear metric in place to do that comparison. Over time, you may choose to be a bit more formal with your reporting approach too, and you may want to align it with a well-known standard such as the Global Reporting Initiative is a good one out there. So in this template, there's a few questions around when you choose to report, how you choose to report, and that's good to get you thinking about the ways that you plan on communicating your progress with your stakeholders. So we've got a few tips for implementation. We don't have too much longer, so I'm going to whiz through all this as fast as I can. So I mentioned earlier around baselining and measurement, and there are some good free tools out there for startups. So you might have heard of the B Impact Assessment, which is run by B Lab, who run the B Corp certification. They have a great measurement tool which helps you kind of assess where your strengths are and where your gaps are as well. And they have also worked with the United Nations to develop what's called an SDG Action Manager, and it also tracks your performance against the UN Sustainable Development Goals. So they're 2 really good tools that you can take advantage of. I would also recommend establishing an internal working group that has different roles within the strategy. So it might be, you know, a head of operations, might be someone in product development, perhaps someone in communications as well. And to get that working group to set a time to meet every quarter and discuss progress and chat about challenges, opportunities, what things are working well, what things need more work is a great approach to take. But given that this work is all quite long and, you know, you can't really achieve anything overnight, it's really important to celebrate those wins along the way and know where your limitations lie and try and get that external support if you need it. So benchmarking progress. So you might be wondering, you know, how do I know that my approach stacks up against the status quo? And I suppose what good looks like is really what we've covered here today. You know, understanding what your impacts are, understanding who your important stakeholders are, having clear short-term goals as well as a longer-term vision, and ensuring that all of your stakeholders know how they can support the work. That's essentially what good looks like, and it's increasingly what is expected of people. But ultimately, kind of knowing your greenhouse gas emissions and having a reduction strategy in place is also basically now seen as a must-have rather than a nice to have. And yeah, I would certainly recommend everyone focus there as a starting point if you are unsure where to begin with it all. Then we look at what great looks like, and I've got some example images here from Allbirds. We're an amazing company that are very transparent about their approach. They're very good at educating the public about what a greenhouse gas footprint involves. They've also embedded sustainability within their business model, so it just becomes part of the way they do business rather than a separate add-on or a, you know, an afterthought or an additional piece of work. It really means that as their business grows, there's opportunities for them to actually have a better impact, a more positive impact rather than an accelerating negative impact. So I think that's a really inspirational case study to look at. If you're not familiar with them, I would definitely recommend that you go and check them out. Another good example is Shopify. So Shopify are really good at thinking ahead, and I mean, they have this philosophy around building a 100-year company, but I also think that it's important for us to be thinking beyond just 100 years, obviously. But what they are doing is actually investing in carbon sequestration projects so that they know that there is going to be carbon credits available for them in the future. You know, they see that the price of carbon credits is going up and up and up. In Australia, it's now sitting around $50 per tonne. So it makes a good business case. They're very switched on, obviously, commercially, but it's also fantastic for the planet and for the environment for them to be supporting these projects and taking such a strong leadership role in this area. And that kind of leads us to the end. So ultimately, we really wanted to communicate that doing something is better than doing nothing. You know, just start somewhere. It can be confusing, but it doesn't have to be. So long as you're clear on why you're making certain decisions along the way, that's really the most important part. And to make sure that you're constantly trying to improve and constantly looking at ways of doing things differently and pushing yourself. There really is no end game necessarily here other than, I suppose, achieving net zero, but then staying at net zero, remaining there can be a big challenge. So there's always more that you can do, and it's about just trying to take things incrementally and improve along the way.